Somewhere in America right now, a bank is about to make more money off a $4 coffee than the coffee shop that sold it. Not through some elaborate scheme, through a single unremarkable moment. Someone's account balance dips $2 below zero, and a fee lands that's worth more than the transaction that triggered it. In 2025 alone, American banks and credit unions collected more than $12 billion this way, through overdraft and non-sufficient funds fees. Add in another $14 billion a year in credit card late fees, and you're looking at a business line worth more than the annual revenue of most Fortune 500 companies, built almost entirely on the same handful of seconds, the moment someone's money runs out before their bill does. And in 2025, after years of momentum toward shutting this down, the federal government did something almost nobody saw coming. It made these fees easier to charge, not harder. Let's start with how overdraft fees actually work, because the mechanism is almost insultingly simple once you see it laid out. You have a checking account. You spend a little more than what's in it, maybe by $2, maybe by $200. Instead of declining the transaction, the bank covers it and then charges you a flat fee for the privilege, regardless of how small the shortfall was. That fee currently averages $26.77 nationally, according to Bankrate's 2025 data, with some banks still charging as much as $35 per incident. A separate but related fee, the non-sufficient funds or NSF fee, hits you similarly when a transaction is simply declined instead of covered, averaging somewhere around $16 to $18. Neither fee scales with how much you actually overdrew. Overdraw by $2 or $200, the bank's cost of covering that gap is roughly the same either way, but you pay the same flat charge regardless. Now here's the number that should genuinely change how you see this entire system. According to industry data, only about 7% to 9% of bank accounts overdraft 10 or more times a year. That small sliver of accounts generates somewhere between 75% and 80% of all overdraft fee revenue collected across the entire banking industry. This isn't a fee that gets spread evenly across everyone who occasionally makes a small math error on their checking account. It's a fee that overwhelmingly comes from a small, repeat-paying group of people who are already living close enough to the edge that a single missed paycheck or unexpected expense pushes them into overdraft again and again. The Motley Fool, citing Federal Reserve data, reported that in 2025, 12% of Americans paid an overdraft fee, but that number jumps sharply along income lines. 23% of people earning under $25,000 a year got hit with at least one overdraft fee, compared to a much smaller share of higher earners. The same research found the fees fall disproportionately on Black and Hispanic households, younger Americans, and people with less formal education, not because those groups make more mistakes, but because they're more likely to be operating with less of a cash cushion in the first place. Let's put a name to who's actually collecting this money, because it's not evenly spread across the banking industry either. According to the National Consumer Law Center's analysis of 2025 call report data, J.P. Morgan Chase collected roughly $1.1 billion in overdraft fees that year, essentially flat compared to prior years. Wells Fargo brought in around $924 million to $1 billion. TD Bank's U.S. arm collected $190 million in overdraft fees in just the first 9 months of 2025, about 14% more than the same period the year before. Across the 20 largest U.S. banks, overdraft revenue was up 4.2% in 2025 compared to 2023, even as a handful of smaller, tech-forward banks had spent years eliminating these fees entirely to compete for customers who wanted them gone. In other words, the fee is disappearing at exactly the institutions with the most competitive pressure to change, and holding steady or climbing at the largest, most dominant banks that don't need to compete on this particular feature. Now let's talk about the other half of this story, because it runs almost exactly parallel. Credit card late fees. When you miss a credit card payment deadline, card issuers are legally allowed to charge a penalty fee, and the current typical amount is around $32 for a first missed payment, climbing to roughly $41 for repeat late payments within the following 6 billing cycles. Multiply that across the entire American credit card industry, and you get a number that shows up again and again in government and advocacy research. American consumers pay approximately $14 billion a year in credit card late fees alone. That's not a one-time estimate. It's been the consistent figure cited by Senate offices, the CFPB, and consumer advocacy groups across multiple years running. Here's where this story takes its most interesting and most current turn. In March 2024, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau finalized a rule that would have cut the safe harbor limit on credit card late fees from roughly $30 to $41 down to just $8 for the largest issuers, those with over 1 million open accounts, covering the vast majority of American credit card balances. The CFPB's own estimate was that this single change would save American consumers about $14 billion a year, almost the entire late fee market, essentially in one move. Public support for the idea was not close. 82% of Americans supported the $8 cap, according to polling cited by the senators who later tried to write it into law. The banking industry, through groups including the American Bankers Association and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, sued almost immediately, arguing the rule exceeded the CFPB's authority under the 2009 Card Act and that fees needed to remain high enough to deter late payments and cover issuer costs. A federal judge in Texas issued a preliminary injunction blocking the rule before it ever took effect. Then, in April 2025, under new CFPB leadership, the agency itself joined the banking industry's side of the lawsuit and agreed to vacate its own rule. The $8 cap never took effect. The typical late fee stayed up near $32 to $41. The exact same pattern played out with overdraft fees on almost the same timeline. A separate CFPB rule finalized in December 2024 would have required the largest banks, those with over $10 billion in assets, to either cap overdraft fees around $5 or show their actual documented cost of covering an overdraft, rather than charging a flat fee untethered to their real expenses. The CFPB projected this rule would save American households roughly $5 billion a year, or about $225 annually for families who regularly pay these fees. The rule was scheduled to take effect in December 2025. In May 2025, Congress used the Congressional Review Act to formally repeal it before it could ever apply. A mechanism that doesn't just block one rule, it also prevents any substantially similar rule from being issued again in the future without new legislation. Two of the biggest consumer financial protection rules of the decade, both projected to save Americans a combined $19 billion a year, were dismantled within roughly 12 months of each other. One through litigation, one through a direct congressional vote. Let's put a real number on why the industry fought this hard to keep both fees exactly where they were. Credit card issuers had projected losing roughly $10 billion a year in revenue if the $8 late fee cap had taken effect. Nearly a full wipeout of the entire $14 billion late fee market. Overdraft fees follow the same shape. From 2020 to 2023, in the years leading up to the CFPB's overdraft rule, banks had already voluntarily cut their overdraft and NSF revenue by nearly 50% under regulatory pressure and neobank competition, dropping from around $11.80 to $12.60 billion annually pre-pandemic down to $5.8 billion in 2023. Once that regulatory pressure lifted in 2025, overdraft revenue at the largest banks climbed right back up. That 4.2% year-over-year increase across the top 20 banks wasn't a coincidence of the economy. It tracked almost exactly with the moment the rule that would have capped these fees got repealed. Here's the part one actually want to hear your take on, because there's a real economic argument on both sides of this one, and it's not just banks are greedy versus banks are victims. The banking industry's actual legal argument, the one that won in court, is that overdraft and late fees exist specifically to deter the behavior that causes them. If fees dropped to near zero, more people would routinely overdraw their accounts or miss payment deadlines because there'd be no meaningful cost to doing so, and banks would eventually have to make up that lost revenue somewhere else. Higher account minimums, disappearing free checking, higher interest rates on everyone's balances, including the people who never overdraft or pay late at all. That's a real economic mechanism, not just a talking point. Cross-subsidization is how a lot of free banking products get funded industry-wide. On the other side, consumer advocates point to the data we just walked through. 7% to 9% of accounts generate 75% to 80% of overdraft revenue, meaning this isn't really functioning as a broad deterrent spread evenly across all customers. It's functioning as a concentrated, recurring cost extracted from a relatively small, disproportionately lower-income group of repeat payers who are already financially stressed, which looks less like deterrence and more like a predictable revenue stream built on an unavoidable pattern of behavior. So which is it to you? Are these fees a legitimate, necessary deterrent and cost recovery mechanism that keeps broader banking cheaper for everyone? Or are they a targeted tax on people who can least afford to pay it, dressed up in cost recovery language. Drop your take in the comments. This is genuinely one where the same $12 billion number supports two very different conclusions depending on which side of the transaction you're standing on. Let's close with where this actually leaves things heading into the rest of 2026, because the fight is clearly not over. Just this year, a bipartisan adjacent group of senators introduced the Credit Card Fairness Act, aiming to write that same $8 late fee cap directly into federal statute rather than leaving it to a regulatory rule that a future administration or a friendly judge can simply unwind. Whether that bill goes anywhere is genuinely uncertain. The same industry coalition that killed the CFPB's version is already positioned to fight the legislative version too. Meanwhile, some individual banks are still competing away from these fees entirely. Several major institutions have introduced small overdraft cushions, next-day grace periods, or completely fee-free checking products over the past few years, specifically to win over customers who are done paying $26 for a $2 mistake. The honest state of the system right now is a split one. A shrinking number of competitive, tech-forward banks are quietly making these fees disappear on their own, while a small number of the very largest institutions, the ones with the least competitive pressure to change, continue collecting well over $1 billion a year each, almost entirely from customers who can least afford it. Nobody sends a single unified bill for this system either. Banks collect the fee directly. Regulators absorb the political cost of trying and failing to cap it. And the roughly 1 in 8 Americans who paid an overdraft fee last year absorb the actual dollar amount, quietly $126.77 charge at a time, usually in exactly the month they could least afford it.